Okay, here we go. I will start by giving all of you a couple of words of background and context. It should be relatively easy to imagine the situation because I'd like you to imagine yourself at a university campus here in Brussels. Now, the only difference with the actual setting is that this university has invited me, and in this case, I happen to be a 30-something-year-old journalist and writer, and I've been invited to give a talk about my latest book. And this book that I've written is called Relentless Change, and the topic of the book is the speed of technological progress, the pace of technological developments, and how all of this impacts our daily lives. They impact both good and bad, as you can probably imagine. Now let's just suppose that you're the interpreter and that you managed to have this quick chat with the speaker, and the speaker has told you, oh, it's all very general stuff that I'm going to be talking about. You'll be familiar with all of this. The only two names that you may not have heard of are these philosophers one of them is called Hartmut Rosa, and the other one is called Bernard Stiegler. Okay, so here we go. Well, good evening, everybody. It is indeed very nice to see such a big crowd here today. It's dark, it's cold, it's wet. I'm sure that a lot of you still have some Christmas shopping to do. I even imagine that some of you still have all of your Christmas shopping to do. Yet you are here to come and think along with me about technology and how technology impacts our daily lives. So I really do want to thank you for taking the time to do this today. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a time where technological change seems to be taking place at an extraordinary pace, perhaps an unprecedented pace. Now, I look around and I do realize that I'm speaking to a group of relatively young people. Now, of course, people can always be described as being relatively young. It all depends on who you are comparing them to. Now, in this instance here, I'm really just being terribly narcissistic, because when I am calling all of you or saying that you are all relatively young, I'm really saying that by the looks of it, you are mainly significantly younger than I am. So anyway, for the purposes of this talk, I think that this has, in fact, two ramifications. It means two things. First is that I am not even going to try to fill you in on technological trends. I'm not even going to mention the new hot items that I need to have someone get me for Christmas. The second thing that this means, the fact that you're relatively young, is that maybe, just maybe, you don't always realize exactly how fast technology is developing and how fast it is changing, literally changing our everyday lives. In just 20 years, a device like a cell phone has gone from being something we saw in science fiction movies to something we absolutely take for granted. Now, myself, as a kid who grew up in the 1980s, and now you have a sense of how old I am, I remember that as a child I would read these magazines where they said that by the year 2000, cars would have computers, and these computers would calculate the best way to get from point A to B. And at the time, well, this was hard to believe. Now, of course, today, a GPS-based navigation system is something which most of us have in our cars. And in fact, we're at the point where even having a standalone device for this is becoming obsolete, because more and more people just use their phone to get that kind of service. And just to give you another example, I think the technological development that best symbolizes and captures the spirit of our times would be the internet. I know I'm not being very original here, but we are talking about something which was literally impossible for most people to even imagine just a couple of decades ago. Nowadays, the internet is part of virtually everything we do. It's part of how we work, it's part of how we communicate, it's part of how we make purchases, it's part of how we choose what to do on the weekend. Now, there's a couple of things I'd like to take a moment to think about. The first is the speed at which these innovations take hold. As we've seen in the examples I've just given, It often takes just a few years, 3 or 4 years maybe, for an invention to grow from a stage where it's something we don't even actually want or think about to a stage where it's something we absolutely need to have. The fact is, these technologies often make it so much faster and so much easier to do some of the things we do on a daily basis that they become irresistible. And as these technologies are irresistible, they become more widely used, and as a result, something that didn't even exist just a few years ago becomes the new norm. It becomes the new normal, the thing that you just take for granted. Now, the impact of these rapid changes, is something which has been thoroughly researched by a German philosopher whose name is Hartmut Rosa. Hartmut Rosa has written a book called The Acceleration of Time, and in his book, he looks, amongst other things, at the way we can travel at speeds which were unthinkable just a few decades ago. He also explores the fact that we are now able to have real-time information exchange. But don't get me wrong. What Hartmut Rosa is doing is he's not glorifying this. He's not marveling at these developments. Instead, what he notes, what he is interested in, is the fact that these evolutions have not, in fact, translated into more free time for all of us. It's as if there's a disconnect. There's a gulf there. On the one hand, you have amazing, tremendous acceleration of technological innovation and economic exchanges, and on the other, you have this sense that we're not really making progress in a more meaningful sense, as a culture, as a society, in terms of happiness and well-being. Now, I'm not a German philosopher, but I still think that we can all agree here that even though technological innovations over the past years and decades have been amazing, have been breathtaking, and they allow us to do things today that we couldn't have dreamed of in the past, these technological evolutions haven't necessarily made us a more relaxed or a happier people. So there's a paradox, if you will. And in order to try and understand this paradoxical situation, I think it can be helpful to pay attention to what another philosopher has to say about more or less the same topic. Bernard Stiegler, that's his name, Bernard Stiegler, he's French. He basically argues that we need to take, and I'm going to use a big word here, a pharmacological approach to new technologies. Now let me explain what I mean by this. When we consider a new drug, medicine, a pharmacological product, we all understand that we need to look at two things. First, of course, we want to see if this new drug, this new medication, does indeed have a positive effect on the illness or condition it is supposed to address. That's the first thing we look at when we think of a drug. But equally important is we understand that any drug, any new piece of medication is going to have side effects. And these side effects also need to be properly assessed. So really, when you think about it, the essence of a drug is that it has multiple effects. Some are good, some are bad, but all of these effects need to be properly evaluated. Now Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher, says that the same is true for technology. He says that technology will almost necessarily have different kinds of impacts on our daily lives, on the way we live. Some of these consequences will be positive, some will be negative. Now, just to give you an idea of the type of research that he does, he is mainly interested in the way technology has had an impact on the way we experience desire. I'm not going to go into that. It would be a bit difficult for me to do that, but what I do want to emphasize is that we need to realize that almost by definition, the very essence of technological innovations is that they are two-sided. And I think that this can sort of help us understand the situation we are in of progress, technological progress on the one hand, and the difficulty to translate that progress into more happiness or more well-being. I'm going to get a bit more practical now, if you don't mind, and give you a couple of examples that, to me, sort of illustrate what I'm trying to refer to here. And I'm going to use, in fact, two articles I have read relatively recently. The first was written by a very good journalist, a friend of mine from the Washington Post, and he wrote a story. This was a few months ago. And in his article, he starts by describing a lady who was absolutely furious with a company that she had hired to do some repair work on her house. So she had a roof that needed to be repaired. She called in people to help with that work, and she ended up being extremely upset about how things went. According to this woman, the contractor had done damage to her house. The contractor had billed her for work he had not done, and he had even stolen some of her jewelry. So of course, she didn't like this at all. And as a result, she decided to do something that's now, in fact, quite common in this internet age. What she did is she logged onto Yelp and posted very negative reviews about the firm that had done this job. Now, I'm not really familiar with the websites that exist in Europe or not, so let me just say a few words about Yelp. Yelp is one of those websites where you have a list of all sorts of businesses. It could be restaurants, it could be shops, it could be a real estate agent, and they're all listed, and customers of these different businesses can give feedback on their experience. Now, obviously, if you're someone who's considering going out to the restaurant or who's looking for a respectable real estate agent, then you will check one of these sites to get an idea of what other people think of these businesses. Now, again, this is actually quite normal. I'm sure you're familiar with the equivalent websites here in Europe, and that was not really the point of the story. The point of the story was a sort of surprising new development which took place. Namely that the contractor, so the business owner who was criticized online, decided to sue the lady for the negative reviews, and he argued that her postings were false and that they had sent customers fleeing. He's actually asking, I think, for $750,000, and apparently there really is a new trend in the US of people fighting back against these negative reviews. They say that it's a form of online libel or defamation. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that there's several fascinating aspects to such a story. On the one hand, my initial reaction is that it seems ridiculous, even funny, that someone could be sued over a couple of paragraphs that person typed up and posted online. But for that person, obviously, this is no laughing matter. That person could be facing thousands of dollars in legal bills to protect herself. On the other hand, well, it's true that the stakes for these businesses can be really high too. And it's true that they have few, if any, solutions to protect themselves against negative reviews, and one can imagine that some of these negative reviews are unjustified. So, it's a difficult issue, and we're learning to address it and see how to cope with it. What are we allowed to do? What are we allowed to say? This issue actually is also thorny because it involves important principles such as free speech. Let me give you a second example, and I'll try and wrap up pretty quickly, but just to give you a second example, which is a more recent development, it actually took place over here in good old Europe. I just read about this. This is a situation which took place in France. It was actually quite comparable to what I just described. It was someone who posted a negative review about a restaurant in and I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, in the Pyrénées-Orientales region in southern France. Now, of course, there was a negative review about this restaurant, and of course, when the restaurant owner found out, he was not pleased, but he couldn't do anything about it directly because the user had posted the negative review anonymously. So there was this long series of exchanges between the owner of the restaurant, who got help from a lawyer for this, and the website. Not the user. There's no way to get in touch with the user, but the website. And ultimately, and this is what's interesting I find, is that a French court recently ruled that the owner of the restaurant should be given the contact details of the person who had posted the negative review. So this is a pretty, we don't know exactly how this is going to unfold from here, but it is an interesting development, I think. And it's easy to imagine how people might want to think twice before they go online and warn other people about a restaurant where they've just had a terrible meal. So to sum up, and this time I really am going to conclude, the pace at which we exchange information is just staggering. It's unbelievable. The way we exchange information is changing all the time. And at the same time, we realize that these technologies have a huge real-life impact, both good and bad. So new situations come up, and we sort of have to improvise a solution or a way to deal with them. And in a way, I'm tempted to think that that is what defines the era we live in. Basically, it's virtually impossible to truly anticipate the tremendous repercussions of technological change. So as a society, as a culture, as a group of citizens, we have no other choice. We have to play catch-up, and we also have to hope that this inevitable change will bring more good than harm. That was the remarks I wanted to share with you, ladies and gentlemen. If there's time, I'll be glad to hear your take. With a bit of luck, your youthful optimism can inspire this terrified geezer. Thank you very much.